When I returned to Colorado from Chicago, I encountered another cultural shock. It really threw me off coming from the West to Chicago when I went out there to go to law school. I'd never really been anywhere east of Omaha, and it was quite an experience for me. One of the things I noticed was how ethnocentric Chicago was and how provincial in a lot of ways it was. But I still had an exciting time in the big city, wandering around, hanging out with various reporters from the Sun-Times like Mike Royko and the people, Stutz Turple. They Sun-Times published the law school paper for which I was editor, so I got to meet a lot of those people. I also hung out at a lot of folklore centers and got to meet a lot of the activist folk singers of that day. I was active in the anti-war movement and the peace movement and various things like that. So I got back to Boulder, and it was a little bit quieter then. It was a little more provincial in a lot of ways, but there was still a lot of activism left over from the civil rights days, left over from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and a lot of the friends that I had made prior to going to Chicago. But there was an additional element in Boulder when I got back, and that was what they called the hippies. There were several groups that moved in right in the mid-60s. One, they were all sort of called flower children. They were part of the peace movement. Various other activist groups. One of the things that struck me at the time was that all of them were centered around various music at the time. They had their own musical culture, and it became a culture into itself. The other thing is there are several indicators of this subculture, like longer hair, activism. Pacifism was a great trait of that era, and everybody professed love, etc. And various other things such as alternative medicine came forward. Well, this shocked the provincial people of Boulder because Boulder at that time was a dry town. It was very provincial. It was pretty straight in a lot of ways. They didn't really have alcohol in Boulder. You can imagine what their response to things like marijuana and LSD were. The flower children, as we would call them, or called them then, came in various groups. They called themselves families, essentially. One of the groups that I'd represented was the Brotherhood of Eternal Light, which was a group of essentially wannabe Buddhists and Buddhist converts and students of Buddhism, etc. Another one was the SPD Family, who worshiped the idea of the drug STP, which was a stronger hallucinogenic than a lot of them. Both those groups were kind of centered around psychedelic drugs like mushrooms, LSD, etc. We had another group centered around marijuana, which were the old hippie types. A lot of my clients in those days would give away more weed than they would sell. One fairly well-to-do client would get a brick of weed every week and drive down 13th Street on what they called the Hill in Boulder and throw a brick of marijuana against the walls of a local establishment there called the Sink and watch all the hippies rummage or run for it to see if they could get their share of the weed before anybody else did. Had a lot of interesting cases come up under the enforcement of the marijuana laws, and things were in a big state of change. Up until then, most of the criminal activity in the prosecutor's office in Boulder dealt with short checks, shoplifting, and things like this. An occasional assault and battery, but nothing real heavy. And pretty soon it got to the point where about 80% of the police work was dealing with drug enforcement, particularly marijuana. The problem about that was it got mixed up in the politics, and particularly in the far right that were very pro-war and pro-military, viewed anybody with long hair or smoked marijuana as a traitor or a danger to this society, or at least to the political establishment. One day I'm sitting in the office and this guy walked in. He was a member of the SPD family. And you have to realize that a lot of the activity and a lot of the difference between the townspeople and the hippies and the influx of new people, and even the college students, the difference was that most of the people in their 40s, middle-aged people, were Vietnam or were World War II veterans. A lot of them risked their lives, fought in World War II, fighting what they believed in, fighting fascism and National Socialism, fighting Mussolini, fighting the Japanese imperialists, and of course fighting the Nazis. Some people, like my father, were present when they liberated concentration camps, which affected him the rest of his life. And I imagine many others that were there right after the armistice. Anyway, most of them felt they were patriotic, and it was their duty to support the country, support the country's policy. But things were a little bit different because they were fighting evil. They were fighting mass extermination. They were fighting mass incarceration and mass movements, mass enslavement, a movement to which they viewed as a method of enslaving people. So they truly believed they had God on their side, and I think the public in general kind of shared that view. The Vietnam War was different. It was perceived as contrived. It wasn't a matter of freeing people from concentration camps or whatever. Anybody who studied the situation viewed it as a religious war between Catholics and Buddhists, as a colonial war between French imperialism and French colonialism, and freedom and broken treaties. It was a very complex thing, and we had teach-ins and sit-ins and things like that at the time to explain to the public. So that was part of the problem. The powers that be were used to everybody acquiescing to the orders of the government, the view of the government, and all of a sudden you had a whole generation who was trained as leaders, trained to be scientists and intellectuals, trained to keep up with the Russians, keeping up with the Russians, but in other areas rather than science, like politics, social policy, and things like that. So we became critical, and one of the things that they trained us as new scientists and new leaders was to use this critical thinking to evaluate situations. So the whole concept of keeping up with the Russians through educational buildup was turned into a weapon against the power elite. And I think they made a conscious decision never to educate another generation to the extent that they did us, because it was very dangerous. We questioned things and anticipated changes and really tried to analyze various policies that the government promoted or tried to put out, and consciously analyze the propaganda. So this made the Vietnam situation much harder to sell than it was the Japanese, German, Italian situation after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. In any event, you had all this strife and dissension going on. You had a lot of intellectual debate about foreign policy that I don't think my parents' generation had. The in-between generation during the Korean War era was introduced to the concept of a police action rather than a war, and there wasn't too much opposition to that. But when they tried that with the Vietnam situation or the situation in Southeast Asia, where it was obvious that we were taking over the French position of Indochina, it became a little bit harder to sell, and there was a lot of resistance to that. In any event, the politicalization of the generations was really a major conflict. A lot of younger people took off to Canada because they didn't want to serve in an undeclared war, or they opposed our foreign policy, but they were all branded as cowards. You had another group that resisted the draft and refused to take the oath, which was real curious. They were branded as cowards too, but I defy any of those people to go through the procedure where they knew their conduct would result in a 5-year prison sentence, because that's what happened when they refused to take the oath. To my way of thinking, these people were pretty brave. The other ones were the conscientious objectors. These people went into the war zone as medics, generally, getting shot at without weaponry. So there's all kinds of nuances that the press and the general public didn't understand or really didn't care about. Anyway, one of the signs of a problem, of danger or emergency, whatever, was an upside down flag. And many of the young people would sew upside down flags to the seats of their pants and strut around town. But one day this guy walked in. He was a member of the so-called SDP family, and they called him STP John, actually. Walked in, and he had been busted for having a flag sewn onto the tail end of his jeans, or in the vernacular, on his ass. I had a case there and one in Denver at the same time, and it was, the crime was desecration of the flag, or flag desecration. And this was under an interregnum DA in Denver. He was a highly recognized Republican former FBI agent, and the thing that most people didn't appreciate of Boulder was the FBI here were the black bag guys. They were mostly counterintelligence because of all the defense installations in Boulder. Anyway, he was soundly patriotic, or at least flag waving, and he prosecuted these cases. At that time, I had a partner named John Bisbee, who was also really interested in constitutional law. And I'd already had a couple of constitutional cases going, and John wanted to take it, and I said, well, go ahead. Anyway, he took the case and appealed it to the state Supreme Court, and actually got it as high as the U.S. Supreme Court on the issue of the flag mutilation statute. We got that declared unconstitutional. In the meantime, I had another case going to the state Supreme Court, where one of my clients was charged with issuing short checks, and at that time was a felony. Well, I raised the argument that what the legislature did was give banks the authority illegally to define criminal activity, because some people got check guarantees, some people just by the fact that they were longtime customers, didn't have their checks bounced. Some were held by the bank. There was all kinds of policy, but only certain people had their checks turned over for prosecution, and that was a denial of equal protection of the law. Then the state Supreme Court bought that argument. I had another group of cases going up on the search and seizure provision of the Constitution, which was making new law. There was other cases I had on right to counsel. And of course, the big case in Mississippi, where the state of Mississippi delegated to the federal government the ability to define criminal activity. A whole bunch of delegation going on back then, and it was a fertile ground for any constitutional lawyers. In any event, one of the groups I'd represented were the initial people manufacturing and developing lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD, which they were producing in a small town north of Boulder called Windsor. The government still to this day feels a lot of that, or believes a lot of that, was done in Berkeley, California, but it's not the case. These people developed a thing of a certain species of LSD that they called sunshine acid, and it was manufactured in Colorado, and the sunshine acid was actually named after Sunshine Canyon and things like that. So this was becoming a very big drug hub, in addition to being a very significant hub for Department of Defense or government intelligence operations, which led me to conclude that the hippies, the drug dealers, etc., were in cahoots somehow with the CIA, which later came back to bite me in the ass, but that's where we're going with this. So early on, I had my suspicions about some of the various groups. There was groups that got arrested and other groups that didn't, and they had different connections. And after a number of years, I ran for district attorney in Boulder, and one of the things that I mentioned in my campaign was that it seemed as though some groups in Boulder, in the Boulder-Aspen dealers area, drug dealers area, had immunity, and others didn't. And if I were elected DA, I would investigate and find out why some did and some didn't, and why they were randomly prosecuting or singling out certain groups. That scared the hell out of a lot of people, I guess, because there were a lot of things going on at that time that I was unaware of, that was unbelievable to me, and later became unbelievable to me, until various other strange things started happening, which I'm going to get into in this narrative within the next 10 or so sessions. So by the time Richard Nixon came about, under the Nixon administration, there were wholesale changes. The issue of drugs became a law enforcement problem. The evidence was pretty clear that the United States was taking over the French position in Southeast Asia, which included the heroin production. And at that time, Marseille was the heroin refining capital of the world. You can think of the French Connection movie taking place in Marseille. That was at the time of the French occupation, or right after the French got out with the fall of Dien Bien Phu, and we moved in with clandestine army headed by Lansdale's group of the CIA. In any event, we took that position. We inherited the French position, including their Corsican-led drug marketeering and the courting of the Highland Hmong tribesmen. We also have pictures of Joe Bonanno there meeting with a few generals, which was very interesting to me at the time. It was also very interesting because at that time also there was a group called the Italian American Civil Rights League, started up by a guy named Joe Colombo, a mafia boss out of New York. And they hired me to become regional counsel for a group called the Italian American Civil Rights League. And this was early in my career. I still hadn't really decided whether or not I'd practice law. I still had delusions of grandeur or being an academician or researcher in criminology. So I told these guys, I said, yeah, I'll represent you as long as you don't jeopardize my license or ask me to jeopardize my license. And as long as you don't bullshit me, and as long as I can research and write about you. And they said, well, that's fine, as long as you write the truth. We'd like somebody writing about us. That's what we're trying to do. That's what this movement is about. So if you write about us and are truthful, then go for greatness. But if you're not truthful, you better watch your back. So I agreed to that, and it became very, very interesting. And a few sessions we're going to go into the connection between organized crime groups and the intelligence community of the United States, going clear back to Lucky Luciano and things like that. Two of my clients were worked for Jack Ruby, for instance, and at that time Jack Ruby was with the Army Intelligence and was supplying weaponry to Cuba, to both Batista and Castro. So I hope to get into a lot of this stuff at a later date. What I will say is my knowledge became very threatening to the government, and after losing a race for district attorney by only 225 votes, the day after the election the IRS came after me, knocking on my door, and I had an IRS agent with me every Friday for 87 consecutive weeks. And I went from a six-man law firm that I had built down to just me. And that's what started me on my road to research and learning about the various connections. Hence the name Dangerous Dinosaur. I hope you stay with me through the series. I'm ad-libbing this. I'm doing tapes rather than writing it down because I don't type. I can't afford a secretary, and I'm not used to typing. I've always dictated everything. So what I'm really doing now is dictating in front of a camera instead of dragon speak, and just leaving it raw, hoping that sometime after I croak somebody might be interested enough to edit these things and put them in some sort of coherent, presentable fashion. But until then, I hope you enjoy the stories. I hope you think about them. I hope you consider them. And if you think I'm full of shit, please tell me. Or if you'd like to know more, please contact me. All I can say is this is from my point of view. These are my experiences, and to me, they're real. To others, they may be fantasies. They may have been fantasies. But there are certain things that can be done to verify what I'm saying. So please enjoy. Please subscribe to my videos. Like my channel. And give me feedback. I really need feedback. I need to know whether I'm on the right track or the wrong track, whether I'm wasting my time or not. Because at my age, I have many things to do, and if this isn't helping anybody go anywhere or be beneficial to any people, I'd just soon do something else. Thank you very much. Bye.